I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Inez Stepman, subbing in for Rachel Bobard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common sense and common good meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And for this week, we have a special all about Afghanistan and the myriad implications, ramifications that go well beyond the current collapse that we're seeing there. So Josh is going to start by talking about the 20 lost years that we've faced in blood, treasure, and beyond in Afghanistan. I'll talk a little bit about the more broad issue of what I've termed an America Last policy. Inez will talk about our clueless experts, so-called experts, the credentialed class. And last but not least, Emily will take us home by talking about media malpractice in connection with the fall of Kabul and all the rest of the mayhem transpiring on the streets and I guess caves and beyond across Afghanistan today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Josh.
So thanks, Ben. Pretty somber episode, honestly. Not really sure, honestly, how to possibly just dive right in, but I guess I'll do the best job I can. I mean, the images that Americans have seen on their televisions, their Twitter feeds for the past few days are horrifying. They're generally horrific. Speaking personally, I have not been this viscerally angry at what I have seen happening out there in the world since at least the 1619 riots following the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis last year and all the anarchic mayhem that spawned, possibly even longer than that. We're talking here, this entire episode is about Afghanistan, so let's kind of get into the nuts and bolts, I guess, as to what happened here over the past 20 years. I mean, thinking back here, on a personal note, I grew up in the New York area. I grew up basically right along the Hudson River. I remember I was in 7th grade when 9/11 happened. I saw the smoke from the Twin Towers. I remember kind of the candlelight vigil in my hometown. I didn't personally know anyone who died at the Twin Towers, but I knew plenty of people who knew people who had friends, relatives. Personally, it was kind of like my political awakening. I was in 7th grade. I hadn't really followed politics to that point. It was kind of like my first kind of visceral, instinctual, in-your-face realization that evil exists in this world and that good must exist to combat evil. So it's just so sobering for me to kind of personally think about that moment now almost 20 years ago, and to think that 20 years later, the Taliban flag will be flying in Afghanistan after countless blood, treasure, spilt, wasted Gold Star families whose children died in vain. To kind of go way back in the day, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when President Bush, had the megaphone, the rubble in 9/11, we kind of all remember, or at Ground Zero, we all remember that visual. His approval rating soared to the highest point of his presidency, 80 to 90%. The American people were effectively unanimously unified to go into Afghanistan. If I recall correctly, Barbara Lee of California was the only congresswoman to vote against the 2001 authorization for use of military force. This was a no-brainer, okay? This is the worst attack on American soil ever. At least since the British burned the Capitol in the War of 1812. We supported going in to get rid of the people that did this to us. But what began as a fairly modest and a mission that was accomplished in fairly short order. It didn't take particularly long for us to go in and secure kind of limited strategic gains vis-a-vis the Taliban, ensuring that they wouldn't kind of harbor Al-Qaeda. Extended over the years and over the ensuing 20 years into what can only be described as just a neoconservative boondoggle par excellence. We kind of went in there, and presidents of both parties, senators, politicians, generals across the political, military, foreign policy spectrum have decided that the goal in Afghanistan, which President Biden, I think, accurately referred to in a generally pathetic speech, but he nonetheless accurately referred to Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires. This is kind of a historically tribal society. Like a lot of Islamic cultures, it is based around kind of the family and the tribe. The entire notion of a quote unquote nation state of Afghanistan is itself kind of a fictitious thing of Western hubris of the neoconservative and neoliberal foreign policy elite class. But we nonetheless went in there. Anyone who's read George W. Bush's autobiography can remember talking about kind of building Afghan institutions, trying to kind of export Madisonian democracy, for lack of a better term, to the third world Islamist tribal backwater of Afghanistan. Look, as early as the end of President Bush's and Barack Obama's presidency, this was obviously a major issue in the 2008 presidential election, combined with Iraq, obviously, as well, which was a distinct issue at the time. President Obama decided to surge a presence in Afghanistan over the objections of his then president, Joe Biden. And of course, it was May 2011. I recall it so well when we went in and we finally got Osama bin Laden. But that was over 10 years ago now. And President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, everyone to one degree or another, since we got bin Laden, has sought to get us out. The issue, of course, is not that we are out of America's longest running war, a war that we have been involved in longer than Vietnam. It is just the disastrous way that we have done so. The epically botched way of evacuating Bagram Air Force Base overnight, leaving behind sensitive weapons, military infrastructure, letting the Taliban go in a matter of days and free high-ranking al-Qaeda militant Islamists from prisons. The collapse of our intelligence community was told us that the Taliban wouldn't be able to take over the country if they ever did. For months, they took it over in days. All the generals who told us over the years that our men who fought there, who died there to train the Afghan security forces to protect the women and girls of Afghanistan, kind of Laura Bush style, from the depredations of the Taliban. All of that looks like a lost cause right now. All of it. I think that's basically a black pill take, to use the current lingo, but I'm not sure there is such thing as another take. Look, I'm happy to throw it open to there just to kind of start off this Afghanistan special podcast episode. I don't think I'm being overly harsh here. I don't think there's such thing as being too harsh in a situation such as this. But maybe someone has a slightly less black pilly take than what I just laid out.
I mean, I can jump in to just say one thing that I'm trying to keep in mind, and we do always try to be optimistic amid all the pessimism, because it's so hard to not be pessimistic. Yes, one thing that I've been trying to keep in mind as we look at a war that was, as Josh says, 20 lost years, and a war in vain, and all of the lives lost, and the lives that will forever be haunted by their experience in Afghanistan, all of the money, as Josh has said, the blood and the treasures that went into this war and into this conflict. The Taliban, of course, it's worth remembering, is evil. And we initially went into that country to root out an evil. And as we sort of take a step back and look at what happened, what's most depressing, I think, is that America cannot root out all of the evil in the world. But we did set out to root out evil in at least one confined region of the world. And we had success, but we could not sustain it. We continued, we stayed under this impression that we could truly root out all of the evil from other cultures, and that we could be bigger than any country could possibly be, as great as as America is. There's nothing we can't overcome evil. We can overcome evil in specific instances, but we can't change the nature of humanity, and we can't go into countries and solve all of their cultural problems after we achieve our military goals and our strategic military missions. And so to look back at, I think, the hubris and the way that our expert class, and we'll get into this more later, defended their strategy and then lied to continue advancing that strategy. In the fall of Kabul itself, we saw this play out one final time, and it'll play out plenty more times before we're done. But we saw it play out one final time in Afghanistan, as they assured us that the anti-Taliban forces that the United States had prepared and trained would be able to stave off a total takeover. They told us this. They assured us this. They went in public and they said this. Off the record, they thought something very differently, and they were speaking about something very differently. And I think that's what it's more than a symbol. It's the consequence. It's the hard consequence. of the total failure of a strategy and a worldview that was born of American success and greatness in the 20th century, and became wildly excessive. And we didn't check it. In fact, we were lied to and lives were lost because of that. So I'll just, I'll throw it over to, I know we all have a lot to say about this, so I'll open it up to everybody else.
People are comparing this to the fall of Saigon. This is much worse than the fall of Saigon, if only because it took 2 days instead of 2 years, right? Saigon held for 2 years after American combat troops left Vietnam. So in that sense, it's worse. But I guess what I was thinking about is a couple things. One, if the quote unquote red pill on the right is that we are living in a post-republic era in the United States, that kind of disillusionment that happened when we went from the Tea Party, which was essentially a restorationist movement, to the Trump voters in 2016, basically saying the system is rigged fundamentally. This is then what Josh said, the black pill, right? Which is that we have condensed the cycle. We're not just post-republic, we're post-empire. Because I can't predict the future, obviously, and I'm not even particularly sort of somebody who focuses on foreign policy at all. I focus much more on domestic policy, but these images don't just look like the end of the American Republic. That seems like a farcical thing to think about in terms of this 20-year war. This looks like a slap in the face, or at least a major blow to American empire and to American power and ability to project power abroad. And then the final thing that I was thinking about while Josh and Emily, you guys were talking about, is we are now going to find out after this, in my view, and there have been some very divergent views on the right on Joe Biden's speech, and I'm sure we'll get to that, but in my view, terrible speech. We'll find out if the American opposition to these ongoing wars is more Jacksonian, or if it's more genuinely isolationist, right? Because I think those two things are very, very different. I think that America didn't see the point, Americans rightly, as opposed to their expert class, didn't see the point of continuing this engagement forever in an exercise of nation building in a society wholly different and culture wholly different than our own, trying to transplant what Josh said is Madisonian democracy into a tribal society. That project they were not in favor of, but that doesn't mean they wanted to see American power humiliated by the Taliban doing donuts in our Humvees because we didn't get them out in time. That's a whole different level of sort of humiliation. And I think Americans are more Jacksonian. I mean, we'll find out. I think what they really kind of want with regard to their foreign policy is the ability to project fear and power throughout the world, to avoid, and to punch people who punch us, but not to try to remake the world in our image. That would be a more Jacksonian foreign policy. But the speech, I think, that Joe Biden gave was essentially defeatist and isolationist. And we'll see which one of those strains is more resonant with the American people, I guess.
So I'll talk a bit just briefly about kind of the narrow near-term issues at play. And then I want to put Afghanistan in context of what I've termed an America last national security and foreign policy that's largely prevailed for almost a generation now, with the exception, I would argue, to a large extent, of the Trump years. Setting that aside, in the immediate term, among the things that I find so disgraceful, beyond the fact that, yes, Joe Biden gave a speech where he made the case for withdrawal, but not defending the failure of the way in which he withdrew. And I've termed this kind of the wrong man attempting to execute the right policy in the worst possible way. And I do think that accurately summarizes it. There are infinite knock-on effects. The first being, of course, yes, there's the propaganda coup for all of our adversaries that the tribal Taliban were able to triumph over the great American empire. There's the waste of incalculable blood and treasure associated with this, which really, it's not only a disgrace in terms of the sacrifices of all the troops that were made for it to end in this way, but then, of course, the families who lost their loved ones on 9/11, which was really the catalyzing event that led to a whole mass of engagements in the region. This is a slap in the face to everyone who's sacrificed and lost, and the American people writ large as well. Obviously, then there's the issue, the pathetic and embarrassing and disturbing, frankly, reality that we haven't seen that there's a Biden administration plan to evacuate Americans on the ground, every American on the ground in Afghanistan. If there's one priority of the administration, that ought to be the first priority. Yet there's already a plan, it seems, to resettle 30,000 Afghans who, even if we could vet all of them and every single Afghan that we were talking about resettling in the US was going to be a patriotic and exceptional American, how is it not that the Americans there are prioritized first? And that, I think, is actually the perfect jumping off point to the segment that I was going to lead on kind of the America Last policy more broadly. So let's go back to, again, the catalyzing event. 9/11. 9/11 was a consequence in no small part of a failure in immigration vetting and then intelligence around that immigration vetting. The response to 9/11 should have been this: we're going to deter jihadists globally by responding swiftly and cripplingly with shock and awe in select areas and in select circumstances, so as to send a message worldwide that if you are a jihadist or a harbor of jihadists, we will hunt you down and kill you in merciless fashion. That was not the message that was ultimately delivered, clearly, after really the first month subsequent to September 11th. And if you look at that George W. Bush address going to Afghanistan in early October, the first few paragraphs talk about going after terrorists and those who harbor them. But then he gets into sort of the flowery language about nation building, Islam being a religion of peace, we're not at war with Islam, et cetera. So politically correct paeans were clearly a secondary focus almost from the start. And now we're way beyond political correctness to wokeness on steroids, as reflected, for example, in the fact that there's the focus on resettling Afghanis before evacuating all of Americans and our assets, of course, which have all been stolen and taken over now, commandeered by the Taliban. But what does an America Last policy do? It puts our national interests sometimes last or clearly not first. Nation building could never have been an America First policy, because it was clear from the history of Afghanistan and the nature of the people, and both the Islamic nature and the tribal nature there, that Afghanistan could never be a Switzerland. So of course it would be a fool's errand to put infinite blood and treasure on the line to try to convert that to someday a Madisonian or Jeffersonian democracy and assume that thus then there would be peace with the US as a consequence of it. Clearly not in America's national interest, clearly not putting our taxpayer dollars and the lives of our men first, not to mention the morale of our country, and not to mention, of course, the fact that there was an opportunity cost to all of this, which is that we've frittered away our dominant position in a generation and opened the door to the likes of China to compete against us as our most formidable adversary. And the same goes really beyond just Afghanistan to the broader policy in the Middle East. What do we look at as the sum total benefits of the so-called global war on terror? And it should have been a global war on jihad, not terror. Again, political correctness here, even political correctness in the naming of the original missions. If you go back and look at, from I think it was Operation Infinite Justice, offended Islamic scholars, and they changed it to Operation Enduring Freedom, I believe. But even setting that aside, what were the real wins? Well, Muammar Gaddafi disarmed. You could look at that as a plus, but then of course we toppled Muammar Gaddafi subsequently. Israel and several Sunni Arab countries came together, but that was only inadvertent. That was a consequence of the Obama administration seeking to make the world's leading state sponsor of jihad our chief partner in the region, in Iran. So basically, those are the two wins, one inadvertent and one converted into a loss. And then we know the loss in terms of blood, treasure, morale, and beyond. And I think it's perfectly encapsulated, again, to go back to the present, of the fact that, of course, the withdrawal is completely botched, and we're talking about resettling refugees, which is not in America's interest, nor probably in the interest of those refugees, incidentally, when they could be resettled at lower cost in cultures more likely for them to be assimilable, not in the United States in the first place. So I think this whole picture, then, to put a bow on it, amazingly now, is that we've transitioned from a global war on terror to a domestic war on wrongthink, namely against those who are the would-be or actual critics of this exact policy that I've just described. And as I write in an article that will have come out probably by the time this podcast is out, Let's only hope that our national security and intelligence apparatus, which failed in almost every single respect, unless you were talking about creating a massive racket, essentially, for those who had a vested interest in keeping these various engagements going for far too long. Let's hope that they're equally as incompetent in pursuing wrong-thinking Americans as they were abroad. And with that, I'm happy to open it up to everyone to talk about these broader issues at play.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much here that, I mean, I'm happy that we're doing a whole episode on this, obviously. So I'll start narrowly on the immigration thing. It is really surreal to me. And, our friend Nate Fisher had a good little tweet thread about this yesterday, that the way for kind of our failed ruling class, like historically, to kind of attempt to kind of salve their wounds and to kind of try to like make good with the country for the, various sins that they have committed has historically oftentimes been to kind of open up the floodgates to immigration. Talk about not learning the lessons of history. I mean, the side-by-side visual of the helicopters evacuating Saigon and Kabul are bad enough. But, as Ben said, and our friend Daniel Horowitz has been saying this over and over and over again for the past 10 years, probably, 9/11, and Stephen Miller had a tweet thread about this just yesterday as well, or earlier in the week, I should say. 9/11 was fundamentally an immigration vetting visa issue. I mean, the hijackers, the people who flew those planes into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, were disproportionately there on expired visas. So look, I mean, a lot of people say, like we need to fight them there so that they don't come here. True to an extent. We don't want to be isolationists. I'm going to get to that in just a second here. But also, we can do a lot more just simply by securing the homeland. So this notion that we are kind of taking in these probably barely vetted refugees, as Ben says, they can probably be more easily assimilated somewhere over there. It's a point that Mark Krikorian from Center for Immigration Studies makes all the time. He's totally right. So just total failure to learn lessons of history as far as immigration is concerned. But look, on the broader point here, I hesitate to criticize Tucker Carlson, who is generally aligned, I think, with this program very much so, but he does take it a little too far in foreign policy sometimes. So earlier in the week, he had on the president of the Quincy Institute, which is kind of a George Soros, Koch brothers funded outlet that is avowedly isolationist, kind of really cozy with the Iranian regime. Not so great. I do worry that there are people on our side, perhaps Tucker among them, who are overreacting to what is quite clearly the failure of the neocon, neoliberal foreign policy establishment and taking it too far. So we ultimately do need to see some sort of kind of third way foreign policy, an America first foreign policy. We can call it Jacksonian, like Inez says. I think that's right. We can call it nationalist, realist. Mike Anton had that wonderful essay at Foreign Policy Magazine called The Trump Doctrine. This is kind of all hitting along the sweet spot of what we should be interested here. For the sake of time, I'll cut myself off there. I'll come back to that a little later, but we definitely don't want to overreact to this and go full scale, kind of 1920 style isolationism. That obviously is not the solution here either.
I guess I disagree a little bit about bringing those who worked with us in Afghanistan. Actually, if we're going to learn the lessons of history in that particular case, it means that we had a large wave of Vietnamese immigration after we left Vietnam, and those people have assimilated and largely become part of the American fabric in a good way. But to me, I guess what shocks me more than anything, if we are in the position, of course, if we're in the position of having to choose between American citizens and people who aren't American citizens and evacuating them, then of course we should choose our own citizens. That is obvious to me, and I'm kind of amazed that I don't know how many people outside of the sort of foreign policy blob in DC would disagree with that statement. But what's shocking to me is that America, the allegedly the strongest militarily country in the world, has to make that choice. That in itself is such a massive failure that I almost don't have words for it. Why is it that we would have to make a choice between vetting people who had worked with us and evacuating our own citizens? Why is it that we had to evacuate overnight and leave all of this equipment? Why is it that's the incredible failure here? Not just that we have not, we've long sort of overstayed our original goal in being in Afghanistan and probably spent, too many lives and too much money trying to convert them into this Madisonian democracy that was impossible. But now we're not even, regardless of what your foreign policy goals are or were in Afghanistan, this kind of complete and utter incompetence, that we would have to make that kind of decision where we would like decide between evacuating our citizens and evacuating people who are almost certainly going to be killed by the Taliban because they worked with US forces. Like that's a crazy, we're not a third world country, or at least I thought we weren't. Why are we have to make this kind of decision? We should have an organized withdrawal with enough time to properly vet people coming out. We shouldn't be scrambling out of the airport because we closed our military base before we even evacuated Americans out of the region. Like that's just, it doesn't matter what your foreign policy goals are at some point if you're so completely and utterly incompetent at achieving them. And Ben, to your point, yes, I hope that incompetence will continue if indeed they turn inward, as there are so many indications that they will, in pursuing American quote unquote insurrectionists and basically domestic wrongthink enemies. Then yeah, I hope they continue this level of incompetence. But it's truly shocking. Even laying aside any disagreements Americans or even people within this foreign policy world have about sort of top line goals in Afghanistan, this is just, there's no defense for this.
Yeah, and I think that's the nail on the head. And before I kick it back over to Inez, I'll just add quickly, I think this speaks to moral confusion and moral rot in the sort of neoliberal establishment. And by that, I mean, we've seen this at our southern border for years and years and years. Do we exist for the world, or do we exist first? Do we exist for the world? Sure. But do we exist first to serve our own people and our own taxpayers? And in order to make that argument, you need to agree that we have our own people and that we have our own borders. But we can't even do that in the most basic sense on our own southern border, when we are prioritizing people whose claims to asylum, for instance, are not nearly even on the level of what we're seeing in Afghanistan. And we've seen people cross the borders with basically a wink and a nod or a pat on the back from our own government, and then murder American citizens or take American jobs and money and resources, et cetera, without paying back into the system. We have our answer right there. We have it right there. And so I don't think it's surprising at all that we saw this confusion play out and in the form of such incompetence, because when you don't know what you stand for, and you don't know really what your national priority is, well, you're going to have these situations play out more and more. And with that, I will kick it over to Inez for her segment.
Sure. And I think we've touched on this a bunch of times already because it is such an important theme in this disaster in Afghanistan. But essentially, not just in foreign policy, but in all domestic policy, basically on all levels, we've really handed an extraordinary amount of power and decision-making power at that to so-called experts, right? And I think in the last election, so many people really wanted, especially after the pandemic and after after the Trump presidency, which I supported and thought was sort of the beginning of a cure, but it was exhausting. The news cycle was, more than 24/7, right? I think that a lot of people wanted to return to normalcy, and they thought that handing the keys back to essentially the same expert class in through a figurehead, Joe Biden, was going to achieve that. And that was never going to work, because the bipartisan bureaucratic class that created the last 30 years that then led to, somebody like Trump being elected, that they created the conditions for that to happen. And so now I think it's after the fall here, we've ducked right back into why it was that this expert class had just failed us over and over and over again. And it's more clear, I think, than ever today. We're ruled by people who are not used to accepting consequences for their actions at all. And that basic incompetence that we were just talking about with closing the military base before we got our people out, this kind of mad scramble, the intelligence failure that all of our intelligence folks are telling both the public and the president that it would take 3 months right? For the Taliban to take Kabul, it happened in less than 3 days. Those kinds of complete failures, I think, have a non-ideological consequence across the spectrum from left to right, of people just being totally disillusioned with that expert class, that it doesn't, at some level, like I said in the last segment, it goes beyond ideology. It's not even just like Donald Trump was elected because that expert class disagreed fundamentally with some basic things that the American people were, either in favor or against, depending, right, on trade, immigration, on foreign policy. But this is one step worse, right? Which is, even if you disagree, if you are taking all this power to yourself as an expert class, you ought to, at the very bare minimum, be expert. And we're not even finding that they're not expert. They're completely incompetent. In a sane country, we would be talking about every person who was involved in this decision-making chain of any like stature or power losing their job, resigning, being fired, right? I don't know that any of us even expect that to happen, because we know that we don't live in a serious country.
Yeah.
So with that, I'll kick it, I guess, out to the crew here.
Well, I was eager to jump in, as Inez laid that out, I think, so eloquently, because I wrote about this at the Federalist today. It's, if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody who was born after 9/11, was born into this world, who was born into the Great Recession, and then born into the lies of Silicon Valley, promising them an optimistic outlook, and instead giving them, pornography on demand and tech addiction, and then the lies of the pandemic. And now you're watching the war that was, supposed to be, it was sort of wrapped in all of the patriotism that it possibly could be. You're watching not just a failure, but a failure that was lied about and was brought about by incompetence. And so you have seen the people in the political establishment lie to you, but also just be terrible at their jobs, at what they make tons of money and have amassed tons of power to do. And to me, that's one of the biggest takeaways from all of this. Obviously, the immediate consequences are devastating in terms of lives lost and money not well spent, and America's credibility not well spent. Those are serious, practical, immediate consequences. But going forward in the future, who is anybody supposed to trust about anything? I mean, we have this conversation all of the time, but everybody who is begging us for our trust and demanding our trust is incompetent, and they lie to protect their incompetence. And so it's just this remarkable vicious cycle. We saw it play out in Afghanistan. We've seen it play out many, many, many times before, but we were told that this strategy was necessary. We continue to be told this strategy is necessary. They're still doing it. Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney, they're still out there championing this war. And it's quite remarkable, to Inez's point, that, just like the Great Recession, well, nobody will be really held accountable, maybe in the court of public opinion for a little bit. But after that, they'll continue to have jobs, and they'll continue to consult and make lots and lots of money. And the cycle will go on and on. And I'll turn it over after that.
Let me just go ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, on the point of, are we a serious country or not? Were we a serious country, one of the first things we would do, and it's not like this hasn't been out there with the Afghanistan papers, for example, is we would actually have a real postmortem done by our representatives on every single aspect at the presidential level, in terms of the Department of Defense, in terms of our intelligence apparatus, in terms of immigration too, for that matter. At every single level, we would have a real postmortem done on Afghanistan from start to finish. And we would find, of course, that the failure of Afghanistan is rooted in ignorance, arrogance, corruption, and then, of course, the bureaucratic inertia of needing to keep the charade going and the lies going as the failures continued, because those in power needed to keep retaining their power and seeking to grow their power and paying off all the constituencies who were invested in continuing the failure and the lies and the incompetence in Afghanistan. The fact that none of that will happen does suggest we are not a serious country. I suspect there will probably be some kabuki hearings, maybe on some of the narrow issues, but not the broader issue of how did we get things so wrong from the start? Why didn't we have an exit strategy? Why didn't we have clear, achievable objectives? Why didn't we know our enemy in the first place? And you better not go in and engage anywhere if you don't know who you're engaging with and beyond. The fact that none of that will happen, what is the explanation for that? I would suggest that the explanation is that everyone is in on it. Almost everyone among our leaders in Washington is implicated in this in one way or another. So consequently, no one has an incentive to actually get to the root cause of it. It's analogous to if you want to go to the coronavirus origins cover up, or you want to go to Spygate/Russiagate and so many other scandals. There's no incentive in Washington because they're all implicated in it in one way or another. And that speaks to the fact, I often think back to Nicholas Nassim Taleb's essay on intellectual yet idiot. We have a credentialed class of people who are expert at one thing, and that is getting into power and then growing that power over time. But the chasm between what they actually want and then what the American people want has never been greater. And so consequently, since half the country roughly is the sole stumbling block to total power, that's why you have to have the domestic war on wrongthink.
Yeah, look, Ben laid that out really well. I honestly don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, I completely agree. A serious country would be holding all sorts of congressional investigations. We would be subpoenaing people in the intelligence community, in the military establishment. The military establishment itself has somewhat escaped our ire on this podcast episode so far. Arguably, probably as much to blame as any other establishment here. I personally would blame the generals for what's happened here in Afghanistan, quite possibly more than even kind of the neoliberal, neoconservative foreign policy think tank sphere blob. I mean, we were just told over and over and over again that our boys and girls were going over there to train Afghan security forces to, defend the country from the Taliban, Al-Qaeda going in again, that they could be trained properly, that that we could possibly convey to this very foreign, culturally distinct civilization the means with which to kind of use Western style weaponry with air support and all that stuff. And they lost the country in 5 days, maybe even less than that. I mean, but Kabul's overtaken roughly 5 days here. There is at the same time, of course, this image has gone viral on Twitter of the U.S. embassy in Kabul kind of promoting the pride flag from June. I mean, talk about look, I mean, it's hard to just look at that and not laugh here. The Taliban is, an Islamist Sharia supremacist outfit, like ISIS, Hamas, or any other kind of Sharia supremacist outfit, not exactly progressive on the LGBT stuff. I mean, how do you think this is a good way to try to do something even mildly productive to indicate that you're there in good faith to see the best thing for Afghanistan? Probably not, right? The generals themselves, I hesitate to use the word purge because it kind of conjures up all these kind of violent images, but we really do need a non-violent purge of the entire general class here. And I don't know how to go about doing that because I'm not trained. I didn't go to West Point. I'm not trained in kind of formal kind of military strategy here. But the number one thought that has come across my head over and over and over again for the past few days, I just can't stop thinking about it, are these Gold Star families. What do we, I mean, George W. Bush said, for all of his flaws as kind of, a leader, said over and over and over again, he was quite poignant about this, and it was kind of touching to see that the hardest things when he was president were to talk to those who were slain in Iraq or Afghanistan, talk to the Gold Star families. What on earth do we say to those people now? We have to be honest and just say that our generals failed us. They were just wrong, that the military establishment was wrong, the intelligence community was wrong about all this. So a serious country would definitely at least start with mass investigations and subpoenaing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's hard to underestimate the transformation on the right on these issues because, I think even several years ago, most people on the right had enormous trust and faith in what might be termed law enforcement and military, right? So in the FBI domestically, in the CIA, our intelligence services, in the military, even up to the top brass of the military, conservatives and Republicans overwhelmingly, perhaps had too much trust. Right now, I think that's what they're seeing now is that, as you said, there is a military establishment that is similar to the political establishment, and just as incompetent, just as wrong, and holding a lot of the same sort of woke beliefs that we're worried about taking over in all those other institutions, right? And that is going to transform the right dramatically, and especially like to realize that our generals, perhaps, and in some of these hearings, hold the same views or are subject to a lot of the same woke forces and views that we're worried about, say, in media, which I'm going to throw it over to Emily to talk about. That is going to transform, I think, the contours of what we think of as conservatism or the right in America. But Emily, I know you're going to talk about media now.
No, I was going to say, we definitely see the bipartisan blob in media, and I think we've seen that play out this week. There's not much to set up this segment. We all know how dramatically different the establishment media, the legacy media's coverage would be if this had been overseen by Donald Trump. In fact, actually, Morning Joe went out of its way today, as we tape on Tuesday, to do an entire segment, basically pinning a whole lot of this on Trump. I think the segment was headlined or on the Chiron, Trump's role in Afghanistan. Now, listen, that is a perfectly relevant area of conversation, but it is incredibly remarkable to see the media's conduct, we all know exactly what this would have looked like otherwise. We've seen them interview John Bolton. We've seen them basically host conversations that are sympathetic to the Biden administration in ways that they wouldn't have been. And to Inez's point about kind of the realignment, this does throw a million different factors up into the air and puts them in a blender. And it's that explains why we've seen a lot of differing perspectives on the right and the left than maybe we would have. And we've seen a lot of agreement on the right and the left than maybe we would have not so long ago. But the media has, interestingly enough, found ways to be sympathetic to Joe Biden. And like I said, I don't feel the need to do a long setup for this segment because it's stating the very, very obvious. So with that, I'll toss it over to everyone else.
I think that we're all speechless here, and it's in part because there's pretty much no way that the media can spin what's transpiring today as somehow reflecting well on the party for which they carry water. And you've seen, so-called tough questioning of administration officials. I would question that sort of a narrative about the narratives that are being put out there. But it was amazing, I will say, to see the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, saying, well, you can't really contrast the images from Saigon or compare and contrast the images from Saigon with what we're seeing in Kabul, because, helicopters are what we use today. I mean, really, if that's where the administration is, it's remarkable. It's also remarkable that the administration wasn't really called by the media on the fact that they were nowhere to be found for days during this crisis, that President Biden himself refused to take any questions after his remarks and was quickly shuttled out of the White House. But I think what it speaks to is the fact that they're bankrupt here. They don't really have a response because everyone sees this for what it is. It's an unmitigated disaster. It's an unmitigated disaster whether you were for or against withdrawal, and that the Biden administration tried to create the straw man of arguing for the withdrawal rather than the way that it's executed or botched that withdrawal, I think really speaks for itself. And I think basically the Biden administration was trying to use the same strategy that they used during the campaign with the media, which was essentially the hermetically sealed campaign and now the hermetically sealed president. They think it'll blow over. There'll be another news cycle. They'll spin it a million which ways. And typically foreign policy doesn't really move voters. At least that's the conventional wisdom. But it is interesting to see in a crisis situation where these images, at least as of yet, haven't been censored, to see whether or not the American people react to the fact that it appears that their president, who's really an avatar for this ruling class and who has sat at the top of it for decades in the national security and foreign policy space as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the ranking member there, and then as vice president and now as president, He's the perfect avatar for this America last failure that we've been discussing here. And the media isn't at all interested, of course, in investigating or exploring any aspect of this.
I really expect that we will see a lot of these images start to get censored in the coming weeks. They really can't do it now because there is such focus around the world and domestically. It would be, even for them, excessively obvious to move off of this as a news topic. But once we've done a few days on this, I would not be at all surprised if those images start coming down off of social media, or if we start seeing censorship on social media of some of the consequences of Taliban rule in Kabul. I wouldn't be surprised if those start to disappear. I guess I'll make that prediction right now. I think the media will try essentially not to speak about this failure and to give it its moment and then move it out of the news cycle. And I think you're right, Ben, even though people aren't generally moved in the voting booth by foreign policy, some of the images that they've had no choice but to allow in these past few days, I think those will stick in the same way that the image of Jimmy Carter in American Decline stuck. It's more than just a failure halfway around the world. It's the embarrassment of America on the international stage, the humiliation of America on the international stage. And even if people don't care what happens in Afghanistan, they do care about seeing their country humiliated. And I think that will stick domestically, despite what I predict the attempts of social media companies and the corporate media to move on from this as quickly as possible, to give it its moment because they can't help it right now. But then to essentially memory hole it and move on to other issues, probably domestic insurrection or whatever other, narrative lines are popular with the media.
The Biden speech was really stunning, wasn't it? He kind of came out there. I thought that, in the aftermath of this just incredible, like across the political spectrum uproar over these images that Americans are seeing on the TV, that he would come out at least like mildly apologetic. I think saying that he doubled down would be an under exaggeration. He like tripled and quadrupled down, to kind of use like the modern parlance. It was a true like DGAF speech, don't give you know what. So I guess like a modicum of credit maybe for like for being that comically self-aware, to kind of just go that particular route. But look, on the one hand, he says the buck stops with the president. On the other hand, he blamed literally everyone other than himself. So pick one. You can't have it both ways there. On the specific media point, there was that interview on NBC or MSNBC with Brian Williams, where kind of the U.S. Army veteran kind of gets on there and says, were you and I watching the same speech there? Because, like the spin job that kind of left-wing cable news is trying to do, which is completely just utterly divorced from reality here. I guess like the one silver lining that could possibly come of any of this. So here I am trying to find like some silver lining of this just utter black pill debacle disaster. The one silver lining is that these horrific images, and like, again, like we haven't even talked about like the images of like the U.S. military convoy planes, like going over the tarmac with people hanging on, falling to their deaths from the tires of the plane. I'm just awful stuff. If those images are not completely censored by like a blob controlled big tech apparatus, so to speak, if they percolate at all, it's possible it has a silver lining of just truly kind of sticking with the American voters intergenerationally in a way that kind of these Saigon era images have stuck. And maybe, just maybe down the road, we will stop with these ridiculous boondoggles. And I'll tie this into closing thoughts when we get there here. But look, I speaking personally, I am not an isolationist. Okay, I think it is ridiculous to pretend that America can just like totally withdraw from the world and ignore what's going on here. I don't think that's a particularly conservative approach to foreign policy. It's certainly not like a national conservative approach and a national interest based approach. So again, that is the wrong lesson to take away from this there. But a lot of kind of like the nation building crusade crowd talks about kind of like the decline of American credibility here. Well, honestly, like, what did you expect would happen when we were there trying to export democracy in a backwater, Sharia tribal civilization? It's not going to work. I mean, like, it's literally, it is baked into the equation from day one that this was doomed to fail here. So the decision to destroy American credibility was made at that very kind of early juncture stage here. And if we care about kind of preserving American integrity and deterrence and whatnot, vis-a-vis our actual true strategic and geopolitical threats, the Chinese Communist parties of the world, the Islamic republics of Iran of the world, and so forth, just avoiding these horrific boondoggles has to be the number one takeaway. So maybe there's like the smallest silver lining there if these genuinely horrifying images stick around, that it'll kind of just percolate in the minds of the American voter in such a way that that may come slightly closer to happening.
So with that, let's go to our parting shots today.
So yeah, I mean, I was just talking, but I'm happy to kind of just continue that line of thought here. So look, we've done a whole episode on this utter debacle. I think it was worthy of an entire episode. I'm happy that we did it here. But I just want to emphasize something that I've said on numerous segments here, which is I do fear that a lot of folks, in our world are going to overcorrect here, are going to look at the total failure of the foreign policy establishment, which deserves to be criticized vehemently, as we have done repeatedly on this episode, and then go to the 180-degree extreme alternative, which is, like a true kind of like Ron Paul style isolationism. And admittedly, like, I see some people on my Twitter feed kind of saying these sort of things. I don't think it's actually going to take off here. But I think the onus is really on, people like us, people like in our circles, to get out there and propose what like a real kind of national interest, America first style foreign policy would look like. And a lot of us, Ben's written about this a lot. Mike Anton had that essay I mentioned earlier. A lot of people have really done this. They've attempted to depict what kind of a true kind of nation state, national interest centric, America first, national alliance, kind of anti-globalist foreign policy would look like here. But I think in the aftermath of the debacle that we have just seen happening in Afghanistan, 20 lost years, countless blood and treasure, the tragedy of the Gold Star families, the military equipment left behind to be seized by the Taliban. In the aftermath of all of that, the failures of the IC, the military, the generals, et cetera, the imperative, I think, is only greater. I think for those of us who are sober-minded on foreign policy, who understand that a conservative kind of quintessentially Burkean sobriety dictates that we don't engage in nation building crusades, but also at the same time, we have to preserve our interests as we properly define them. I think the imperative is really on us to kind of start formulating what that looks like. I'm not calling on like Ben to write like a scholarly white paper or anything on this, but hopefully this galvanizes folks in our world to kind of just, pick up where this debacle is left off and kind of get a new message out there.
Sure. I guess I'll go next for these wrap up thoughts. If the overarching story, and I'm not saying anything original here, of our era, let's say starting in 2015, 2016, is collapsing institutional trust, there were a couple blips exceptions to that in, for example, Pew polls, long-term polls on trust in various, not just government institutions, but in media and in various parts of government, Congress versus the president. We've all seen those polls, right? It's every institution, on big business, media, everything. It's all in the tank and has been for a long time. There were essentially two exceptions to that, 2.5. One was small business, and the other was the U.S. military. Those were the two sort of institutions in American life that still had bipartisan trust and support. This is going to put, and it's coming on the heels of a bunch of disappointments, but I think none with the kind of iconic imagery that is really going to seal it into the head of every single American who sees those images. But it is following up on, woke military ads and testimony It's the ideological purging within the military, like trolling service members, social media presence for any kind of wrongthink. It's the farcical deployment of the military and the National Guard after January 6th for weeks, if not months, in the Capitol. The spying scandal on Tucker Carlson, which has completely dropped out of the news, but that our intelligence services essentially admitted to the basics of. Even in their statement, all of those things were creating the trend away from trust in I don't think in American service members, but in the military as an institution. This is going to put a nail in the coffin of trust in the military, and that is, I mean, it's deserved, but it's not a good thing. That was the one thing we had kind of left in common, that we did trust, that across the political spectrum. And I think actually here I'll quote, or not quote, but bring up the Vox piece on something seemingly unrelated, which is there was a Vox piece hitting the Claremont Institute and sort of folks in our circles for their alleged lack of patriotism during the Olympics. I think this is the same thing with putting up in Kabul, putting up the gay flag, the LGBT flag outside of our embassy. When America becomes synonymous not with the traditional values, institutions, and people that we thought it did, but actually with this woke globalist project, you're going to see a collapse in patriotism, and that is going to have far-reaching consequences. The lack of trust in the military and the collapse in patriotism, both deserved. They're still, I'm very worried about the consequences of those two things.
Yeah, and I'm actually writing about that Vox piece right now in this context. It's totally related to all of this. And here's the good news, actually. Like, it's fantastic that the public has no faith in our institutions right now, because our institutions deserve literally no trust. They deserve no trust. I would be concerned if our institutions were trusting, or if our public was trusting our institutions at this point. And similarly, it's actually a good thing that people are starting to get sort of woke, as people would say, about the state of the country, because for too long it was a complacency that sort of lulled us into ambivalence and lulled us into inaction, and just said, this can't come here, not to the United States of America, because everybody who's alive in the country right now and in charge of our institutions, with the exception of Gen Z, which is not yet in charge of our institutions, came from the 20th century, the American century, and any sort of like real decay felt impossible. So to the extent that we have a silver lining right now, it is absolutely that the trust is gone. It is bad to have a country in which there is no trust in institutions, but in a country in which those institutions deserve no trust, the lack of trust is at least the first step. The first step is admitting you have a problem. And I think we've at least crossed that point. The question is whether we'll be able to claw out of this hole.
Yeah, I agree. The institutions have rightly discredited themselves, and let's hope that the response of the American people is not to slavishly bend over backwards and submit to all of their diktats going forward. Although I think the entire coronavirus response, and the percentages of Americans who are willing to go along with the policies, no matter the flip-flopping, no matter the clear politicization of science, which is intolerable, just like the politicization of the military is intolerable and will literally, and has already, cost Americans life and limb, to some extent, to me, makes me a little bit more sober about some of the polls that rightly, I think, do engender optimism in terms of how the institutions have discredited themselves. So I hope the American people are as distrustworthy as we think they are, although it is also sad at the same time to think that an institution like the military has suddenly lost the faith of the American people. And worth noting, by the way, that Josh talked about a purge of military officials that did transpire under the Obama administration. And now you have the continued effort to go after wrong thinkers. So I think the military, as I've written before, is just following all of our other institutions. Progressivism corrupts everything that it touches. And that's why we've had this woke march through the institutions and seen the real world consequences of it. I want to go back to kind of the start of this, which was, Josh was talking about the fact that he's touched thinking about the Gold Star families. And I think that's a point well taken. And I go back to also 9/11 itself. I, like Josh, I was in, I think, 8th grade at the time, growing up in a New York suburb, 40-minute drive from Lower Manhattan. My father was in Lower Manhattan that day. And I remember sitting in school. We didn't have any screens on, had no idea what was going on, except all these wild rumors and speculation about different buildings being attacked by planes across the country. Didn't know that the World Trade Center was gone until was picked up from school late that day around 1:30 or 2 o'clock or so. But I will never forget the sounds of people being called to the office one by one over the loudspeakers that day, and knowing, what happened to their parents, potentially to their families, to their loved ones. And there were people in my grade and in other grades who did lose their parents that day. My father came home hours after the attack, and he was essentially covered in ashes. And I'm sure it was the same experience for countless people in this area and in other parts of the country as well, or who were touched by it in other parts of the country as well. And so what does America First look like? What should a national interest oriented national security and foreign policy look like? It should honor the lives of the fallen and the aggrieved by putting Americans' lives first and American liberty first. And in almost every respect, if you look at our long-term response over time, it has not been to put American life and liberty first, to put the lives of our troops first, to put the taxpayer dollar, of course, first. If we did, if we were to engage, we would know who we were engaging with. Again, we would have clear goals, strategies, and tactics to achieve them based in realism and an understanding of history and whom we're engaging with. We would have clear exit strategies. There would not be a whiff of mission creep associated with them. And to the extent there was deviation, those who deviated would be held accountable. There's been almost none of that. And the reason I went to the issue of refugee resettlement in Afghanistan versus first ensuring that you evacuate every American is just a prioritization issue, first of all, of American lives first. And then second of all, the fact that it is absolutely true that it would dishonor those who fought alongside us to not help them in a time of crisis. However, resettling them in America, when again, 9/11 itself was an immigration issue, I just think speaks to a massive disconnect. And in fact, after 9/11, our policy was the mass importation of people from Islamic countries around the world. And again, even if they were all patriotic and 100% assimilable and the like, is that really the rational or logical response, or should that be the first priority? I would suggest not. And so that's kind of why I went there, in the contrast of the America First vision versus a vision of something else, potentially putting the lives of others ahead of those of American citizens. So is there something positive that can be taken from this? Well, the utter failure of the globalist, Wilsonian, progressive project is on display. The corruption of our institutions has been put completely on display, and no American can turn away from it. We can take the wrong lessons away from it to the extent we don't put forth the right arguments about what the U.S. national interest looks like and how best to pursue it. But that said, when we do have failures that come from false or wrong premises or corruption and the like, it does expose itself over time. And that's why you can make the case that the facts of life ultimately do prove to be conservative. I think that's a fitting way to end this episode of NatCon Squad. For Josh, Inez, Emily, I'm Ben Weingarten. Tune in next time, and we'll see you on the next NatCon Squad.